shape that might be a footprint. These were clear, anatomically distinct. It had tension cracks, pressure ridges, slide-ins, evidence of midfoot flexibility. A footprint would turn off to an angle as it looked over its shoulder.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Paranormal Portal Podcast. I'm your host, Brent Thomas. Thank you all for joining us, and special thank you goes out to all of you who continue to support the podcast and continue to spread the word. Always remember, if any of you out there have experiences of your own that you'd like to share, feel free to email me at paranormalportalradio@gmail.com. Again, paranormalportalradio@gmail.com, and you too could be a guest on the show. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a show for the ages for me personally. Our guest today is someone that I've been a fan and following his work for years. He's certainly doesn't need an introduction, but I'd be remiss not to give him one. So our guest today is Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who is joining us to discuss all things Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and we're going to try to pick his brain and see what we can find here. But I hope you guys are ready. This is going to be epic. Dr. Meldrum, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure too. And you're certainly, we were talking a little bit, and you are literally everywhere in this subject, and I'm absolutely thrilled because you've brought a voice that I think was desperately needed, and you of course, there have been others, of course, that probably pioneered the scientific aspect of all of this, but it's been incredibly empowering, I think, for those of us that are believers in the phenomena to have a voice like yours in the fray. And I think maybe you've said this a million times, but for the sake of the show, would you mind telling us, how did this journey start for you?
Right. Well, it goes way back to my younger days when I was, 9, 10, 11. I was at a very early age fascinated with natural history. And of course, I think all kids, at least of my era, went through that dinosaur phase where had your plastic dinosaur set from American Museum of Natural History or wherever. And the cavemen, of course. I was fascinated with human evolution. Mm-hmm. Just kind of gotten a feel for the paleo aspects of paleoanthropology. And of course, I didn't know those words at that time.
Sure.
But I can actually remember coming home one trip to the library, especially during the summers. My parents, back in those days, would take us down to the library, and we'd usually get a stack of science fiction novels to read, and literally read through an entire stack. And on this particular trip, I remember my stack had a couple of science fiction novels, usually space adventures, Lester Del Rey and Andre Norton and so forth. But I had the rest were prehistoric life as dinosaurs as cavemen and human evolution. And it kind of raised the eyebrow with my parents at that point. But so when the announcement was made, when there was a conversation at school, actually, of some kids who had seen the advertisement for a showing of the Patterson-Gimlin film in the Spokane Coliseum, where I was living, kids were all abuzz talking about this. And a couple had seen at that time, I think the Reader's Digest version of the Argosy article had come out. Mm. The Argosy or Atlantic, one of the magazines that had carried a story. And so some of them actually knew what Bigfoot was based on this. And of course, this was the first time I'd ever heard of Bigfoot, but it sounded like it embodied all these things that I was fascinated with. Mm-hmm. And so running home and finding the newspaper and convincing my dad that he just had to take us to go see that. So he and I and my younger brother went to the Coliseum and were there early so we could get a good seat right up front. And it was, what an impression it made.
Yeah.
And so things rolled forward. I was the type of personality. My brother is even more so. He's almost savant in some respects. He would turn his attention to a topic and turn into a walking almanac of trivia, whether it was sports trivia or aeronautics. He could look up and see the contrail of this little silver dot and tell you which model airplane and what the airspeed was, and so forth. And he was just amazing. I never had that quite talent, but when I would get focused on a topic, I would really dig into it and do a lot of research. The next year in school, we actually did a unit on primates in 6th grade, and it was really quite interesting as the teacher was leading us in a discussion of what a primate was, what were the defining characteristics, and we were listing these on the board, and then we started listing examples that we could think of possible primates, and she was kind of pushing the envelope to include, to not pushing the envelope beyond, but to our thinking envelope beyond just monkeys and apes to include prosimians and so forth, lemurs and lorises. Somebody, to be clever, raised their hand and said Bigfoot. Well, rather than, as often would be the case, just dismissing that offhandedly, this teacher, to her credit, said, well, let's look. What are the traits? How has Bigfoot been described by those who claim to have seen it? And as they listed some of the characteristics, the conclusion as a class was drawn, this would be a primate if it existed. So she added it to the list.
Oh, neat.
Well, the next step was we all volunteered to do reports. We had to do our research report. And so when it came to Bigfoot, my hand shot up faster than anyone else. And I got to do that topic and so on and so on. There were some interesting, one I'll share with you, because I sat there and wondered afterward, what was I going to do? I mean, since attending the film presentation of Patterson, I had gotten Patterson's book, and I had found a few newspaper clippings. I'd gone to the library, found Ivan Sanderson's book and so forth. And so I had done a little bit of research, but I didn't have a lot of material. And I'm thinking, how am I going to do a substantial report, a research report? And she said, go talk to your librarian. Of course, that's the answer. Back in the days before Siri or the internet.
Sure.
And to make a long story short, my librarian had a brand spanking new copy of On the Track of the Sasquatch by John Green, which she very generously checked out to me, let me take. It was kind of in the special collection or special materials, resource reference materials, but she let me check it out for this purpose. She also had a clippings file folder with newspaper and magazine articles, quite a few. Well, years later, here's where the twist was interesting. Years later, I was doing a presentation, my first public presentation at Harrison Hot Springs in British Columbia. And as it turned out, I was an invited speaker, but there had been a snafu and my room reservation had not been made.
Ooh.
And so they were sold out, and there was no place, no room in the inn.
Oh, no.
I was contemplating, sleeping on the beach when I hear this voice behind me and said, oh, don't be silly. You're coming home with me. I turn around, and there's John Green.
Oh, wow. That's
awesome. I'm just like, what? And not only did I get to spend the weekend at John Green's home, but John Bindernagel was his other house guest.
Oh, neat.
Had arranged to stay with the two Johns. And so, man, talk about an introduction.
Yeah.
I was just blown away. And in the course of the conversation, of course, as I said, I was kind of obsessive, and I had soaked up lots and lots of information, lots of details, reading and rereading these books and preparing this presentation and so on and so on. And so when John was both Johns, but John Green was quite impressed and curious. How was it that I knew all this information? And so I gave him a little short background, and And he's looking at me. He says, "What school did you go to?" And so, we're talking, this elementary or Indian Trail Elementary in Spokane, Washington. And he goes, "Well, what was your librarian's name?" And I said, "Well, that's 20, 30 years ago." I said, "I don't remember." And he said, "Was it Mary Bessaker?" And it's just like the penny dropped. It's like the ring of familiarity. I go, "I think so, yes." He goes, "That's my niece."
Oh, neat.
And so he picks up the phone and dials this number and says, "Mary, yeah, John here. Yeah, you'll never guess who's sitting across the room from me." And she remembered because I was the first student to check out that book. So she remembered very clearly. She had just gotten that book brand spanking new from John, and I was the first student to actually check it out and show interest in it. And so, talk about a small world,
Right.
It was just amazing. And there've been so many experiences like that. Of course, when you're looking with 20/20 hindsight,
Sure.
it's easy to see things align because you're looking down the line you've traveled,
Sure.
as opposed to all the alternates that could have occurred. But it is uncanny in a way how things just kind of so many times put me in a place, in a position to have an extraordinary experience.
Yes.
And one of those was when which really set me down this path in this phase of my life, was when I paid a surprise visit to Paul Freeman in Washington. Right. And in fact, I just had the book out. I was making reference to it. I'd been asked to write a little book review of Bigfoot of the Blues by Vance Orchard. And so as a result of my sort of background research for that book review, I had established a contact with Paul and intended to go up to visit him. But circumstances, again, just a set of serendipitous circumstances, placed me and my brother in the region. And so we paid a surprise visit. As it turns out, he had just found some tracks, the first of that year, 1996, in the foothills, where the snow had melted back far enough, exposed these muddy roads, and in that fine soil, rich in loess, very clay soil, these just absolutely distinct footprints were preserved there and were very fresh. They were laid down in the wee hours of that previous night or morning of that day. 15-inch tracks, long line, 35, 45, clear footprints. I mean, there was no ambiguity. They either were cleverly hoaxed or these were Sasquatch tracks. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Wow.
One or the other. And so, I was just immediately impressed by the circumstances and kind of pinching myself because I was honestly at that point, because of many things that had been put in my ear, so to speak, was skeptical of Paul and his claims. And the coincidence of this, although I kept saying to myself, how could he? There's no way he could have known. Right. And even if he could have known, how could he have gotten this done in this fashion in such a short period of time? I mean, the most he could have had an inkling of our having come there would have been just a matter of hours.
Wow. That's cool.
So the hook was set deep. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't just a single isolated shape that might be a footprint. These were clear, anatomically distinct. It had tension cracks, pressure ridges, slide-ins, evidence of midfoot flexibility, and so on. And the behavior was, it was there. You could see where, a footprint would turn off to an angle as it looked over its shoulder, and then it would turn and run, and the toes would slide across the track and curl and dig in. And then, with twice the stride length as it ran down for cover across a fallow field. And it was just amazing. And so, here we are 6 years later, and I have over 300 footprint casts in the laboratory. And so it just it has provided a sample that has allowed for inferences to be drawn based on that.
Sure.
extensive information rather than on just single isolated examples, rare examples. So it's been amazing. Yeah, that's how it got rolling.
That's fascinating. And I think a lot of people that are on the skeptical side of this would say, well, you take some plywood, you cut out a foot shape, and you go stomping through the woods, boom, you got Bigfoot. Well, the way that you're describing these tracks shows that whatever made it wasn't just one stamp. It was several variations based on the motion of the individual at the time. Absolutely. Including like the toe flexibility. I mean, you can't stamp that into plywood.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you would have needed several sets of static. I mean, short of having some animatronic contrivance that was capable of articulated movements that could set or respond, from whatever mechanism. I mean, but John Green offered a $10,000 reward. He was good for it. He was absolutely dead serious because he was tired of the armchair skeptics making such vacuous allegations. And, the whole episode with the Wallace family and those ridiculous carved feet demonstrated just all too clearly how silly such a suggestion is, and the attempts to demonstrate how they would have been used in, I laughed at one where they said that the person with the fake feet donned would simply hold on to the tailgate of a pickup truck as it drove slowly so that he could vault and make the extraordinary stride. And to watch that person catch the toe and pitch into the borrow pit, or the reporter who was standing in the wet, muddy soil in order to get a good, deep impression because you're wearing snowshoes, essentially. And then after standing there, introducing his story and so forth and cutting to the clip, and he then turned to walk away to show how easy this would be. Well, by this flat wooden surfaces just glommed onto that mud, or the mud glommed onto the surface, rather. So first he's struggling to try to lift a foot. He's just about falling, and then one foot peels free with about 2 inches of mud adhered to it, leaving a completely nondescript crater in the mud with no features. And then, of course, the foot plops down and transfers all that mud to the next step. There's no details whatsoever. Yeah. It's just, it's so transparently ridiculous to make the suggestion that, it's just this or it's just that. And to this day, no one has stepped forward to demonstrate the capability of creating such things and collected the bounty. There have been some interesting attempts. Sure. A couple that have been quite not sophisticated, but I mean more anatomically accurate carved feet, but still transparently hoaxed, and the dynamics of the trackway produced are obviously static and or non-dynamic, the lack of dynamics. Kind of a rash of drawn-down reservoirs in drought here in the West presented a canvas for the hoaxer to ply his trade.
What's never ceases to amaze me is the lengths to which the skeptical side of this, the skeptical people, will go to try to discredit any of this. It's like it's kind of like with everything in the paranormal. It's swamp gas and the light of Venus. It's weather balloons. It's just fog. Any number of different phenomena. Some of the explanations are more impossible than just saying, well, maybe it's a Bigfoot. Maybe there was a Bigfoot there.
Exactly. No, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, I also am puzzled at times by the preoccupation of some individuals in the name of skepticism.
Right.
I mean, it's as if they wear it as an arm badge, a badge of honor.
Right.
And they, I mean, get a life. Simplest response is, why is it, if they think this is so ridiculous and so transparently false, why would you spend day after day? I mean, some of these guys, with their web pages and so forth and their presence. I mean, I don't follow these things closely, but I'll scan just to see, because it's always in some. I mean, if they serve any purpose, it's like it's like the grindstone. That's how you get a sharp edge, is you have to have that abrasion. And so they're my grindstone. They keep me thinking,
Sure.
How would I respond to this? And but as a result, I noticed some of these personalities, and they pop up once in a while on my Facebook page or my personal social media venues. But why? Why are they
right?
Nothing better to do with it, nothing more productive, if they think it lacks so much credibility and worth. It stymies me. And
then you consider, just speaking of tracks, of course, a lot of the locations are just so remote and out of the way. If somebody was going to go to all this trouble to create a hoax, they would do it in a place where people would see it, like a park or maybe a very public and active campground or something like that, because that's the notoriety end of it. But, who's going to go up into some remote mountain valley, at the thaw of spring and get up there and make tracks, and the idea that maybe somebody's going to come along and check it out.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah. And the devil's advocate, the skeptic would say, but someone did, or we wouldn't be talking. Someone did find them, or we wouldn't talk about them. Sure. But I can speak from personal experience too. I have found tracks in some remote circumstances where the prospect of someone else having been there or having any inkling of our arriving there was virtually non-existent. And so how do you account for that? Then it boils down to identification, misidentification. That's the thing.
Sure.
The 300 some casts that are there's a half a dozen or so that are obvious hoaxes. Oh. Now there's some that are less distinct because conditions vary so tremendously out there, and some casts are footprints that are less perfect, if you will, in their preservation of anatomical detail. But the thing that I deal with much more than hoaxing, intentional hoaxing, which unfortunately garners headlines, is misidentification. People either misidentify bear tracks that are a common candidate because it's a hind foot is elongated, flat foot, the heel nearly in contact with the ground or in contact with 5 toes into contact with the ground. But otherwise, there's just reading too much into any shape that even remotely approximates an oblong impression of a foot. And so that's what I deal with by far more commonly than outright hoaxes.
Right. Now, do you feel that hoaxing is a significant problem in this, though? I mean, or does it come up a lot where people are going out there and leaving hoax tracks, or how much?
No, as I said, I think it's really kind of rare where there is an intentional, especially any elaborate. And there have been several. There was a kind of a rash of the drawn down reservoirs due to the protracted drought here in the West has presented a canvas for the hoaxer to apply his trade. And because you've got these extensive mud flats that are more conducive to leaving an impression, an impressive impression, series of impressions with fake feet. Even here in Idaho, we had a case up at the Palisades Reservoir, and I went through the motions. I mean, it was an opportunity to demonstrate and to practice the data collecting methodologies that I am always advocating other citizen scientists to employ. And so we did document it, we photographed it, we measured it, we taped out the trackway, we made a half a dozen or more casts of representative footprints. But in the end, it was quite clear that they were hoax. The anatomy was not compelling, convincing. There were tells like sharp edges of the carved plywood. There were angles of the toes and so forth.
Sure. Yeah, dead giveaways.
Yeah, were giveaways. But but as I said, those rare instances oftentimes get a lot of headline, whether in the Bigfoot community or picked up by the news media, and because oftentimes there is a skeptical narrative to perpetuate. Right. And so the bad examples, the obvious hoaxes get featured because they perpetuate that narrative. Sure. It's just like with hair samples, for example. A hair sample that defies attribution to a known form of wildlife on the basis of its microscopic anatomy, but yet fails to produce DNA to make definitive identification, doesn't get any traction as far as publication in orthodox journal or media, scientific media. But if someone picks off a muskox hair from a barbed wire fence and sends it into the Forest Service, or Fish and Game, and they come back and say, "Oh well, yeah, this is a," then it gets just like even more dramatic, and this is another problem. There was the hair that was analyzed by the FBI. Oh yeah. The report was released through a Freedom of Information Act, FOIA request, and it turns out it was a hair sample that was submitted by Peter Byrne, and it turned out to be deer. Yeah. Well, and of course that got all kinds of headlines. Yes, it did. Why? Well, because one, it perpetuated the skeptical narrative, and two, though, it also featured the fact that a federal agency actually, which I was impressed by, actually followed through and did an analysis, did a study of it. Right. Although the headlines on that one were a little misleading. Like FBI has researched Sasquatch, and it's like, well, they checked out a hair. They checked out a hair, exactly, and then they were quite willing to release it. Had they come to a different conclusion, they might not have been willing to release for whatever reason. But the point being, it perpetuates the narrative that any time a serious entity, a serious researcher, or someone who's perceived to be not invested, as I'm accused of being now, then when that happens, the result is always the same. It's misidentified. It's easily explained and attributed to something else. Sure. Now, so in that sense, I resent the fact that Peter would submit such a sample, although I'm impressed that they even took the trouble to look at it and file a report that could be retrieved. Sure. Deer hair has such a distinctive anatomy. The medulla looks like a honeycomb, and it's quite dominant in the diameter, dominates the diameter of the hair shaft. You can stick it under a microscope, even a cheap microscope, and immediately rule it out as a possible primate hair. It's ungulate, it's deer. And so by sending something like that in, it's grist for the mill. It was a real disservice to the effort, and so I do resent that. Sure. But
I think that's why I hold you in such high regard personally, because I think it takes a real tenacity and perseverance in order to stand in the face of all of this opposition, especially in 99% of your field. There are people pushing back on that all of the time. And I got to ask you, has there been times you're just like, oh, I just don't know if I can keep doing this? You know, how has that journey been?
I've always had a bit of a thick skin. I've always seemed to be attracted to controversy. I find that interesting.
Sure.
It's the edge, the fringe, where the interesting questions lie, rather than submit a grant proposal to do research when you already really know what the outcome is going to be. I mean, someone needs to do that, but it can be somebody else.
Sure.
I would rather do something else. So I've always had a thick skin, but I tell you, there've been moments when, when it looked like I might not get tenure because of this. There were a lot of sleepless nights.
I'll bet.
And there were times when, I never had regret.
Mm-hmm.
I had anxiety as to what the future held, but I never had regret for the path that I had followed. And, I look back now as I'm rounding third and heading for home, basically, and professionally in a sense. I look back and I sometimes reflect on that and wonder, was this a prudent course of action or not?
Sure.
And invariably, I come back to it. I mean, I think the contribution that I've made in this capacity is as I think it's more significant than what I would have made if I had continued down the path that I was previously on, because of the fact that I think this is such an important and timely topic. And in '96, the notions about the pattern and process of human evolution that we now accept as conventional wisdom we're undergoing some changes. I mean, we've seen as the number of recognized species continues to multiply, and as evidence of more recent persistence of several branches of this now bushier and bushier family tree are acknowledged.
Yeah.
The context for the existence of relic hominoids is more and more established. Now, the evidence, I think, continues to mount, and while we haven't had tremendous breakthroughs, I think we've had clarification on a number of issues, and we're witnessing a turnover of generations, which I think will usher in a much more objective attitude towards the evidence.
Yeah,
I really do. So I really don't have any regrets. I mean, it's been an amazing ride. It's afforded opportunities to visit places, to experience cultural interpretation of this phenomenon in a variety of different settings. It has exposed me to evidence that is really astounding, and I think it put me on the cutting edge. I predict that the notion of relic hominoids will continue to garner interest and support, and the upcoming generation of anthropologists will be much more open-minded towards the prospect. And eventually, and that's what is required before you get, those individuals have to then they must begin to populate the department chairs, the deanships, the society presidents, the program organizers for conferences and so forth, before the spigot for funding and for personnel and for justification of the pursuit of these kind of questions becomes a real possibility. So I think we're still a decade or so off. That's why one of the reasons I hope to stick around long enough to see that take place, because I think it'll be exciting to see the advances that will occur in the next 20 years. Sasquatch type, the Yeti type, the Almas or Almasti, and then you have the little ones, the orang pendek type of Southeast Asia.
Well, inversely then, is it also frustrating that more of your field isn't taking an objective look at this phenomena and the evidence that is there? Is that also equally as frustrating?
It is. Okay. It is. And I would say on the other hand that more takes place behind the scenes than most people are aware. Okay. In other words, there are many of my colleagues who express interest but yet would not openly talk about that interest, nor I don't think there is no one in the wings as I was for Dr. Krantz to step up to take the baton from me in the academic wings. I mean, that is, they're investigators and researchers, but I edit a journal that it's an online peer-reviewed refereed journal called the Relic Hominoid Inquiry. And one of the reasons that I have persisted at this is that it provides not only a venue for the dissemination of information, of good research papers and reviews and commentaries, etc., archival materials, but it also engenders dialogue. Right. Because if I get a submission, say it's a submission on vocalizations, I don't send it to just a couple of Bigfoot investigators to review. I look and see who out there is publishing in the mainstream, if you will. Who are the movers and shakers in primate vocalization research right now, and I send it to them. And I've only had, in the 12 years that I've been doing this, I've had only one manuscript, one request turned down. And I've had one, I qualify that. I've had one or two responses, but dozens and dozens of requests, most of which the individuals with a cold call like that have come back very intrigued. Wow. And on top of that, often very encouraging because I invite them to examine the publication itself online and just get a sense of the type of thing if they're not familiar with it, and have garnered many positive remarks and encouraging words. People that, hey, this is really interesting. Keep it up, keep going at it. But the one refusal was not because of the subject matter. In fact, they said, this looks like a fascinating paper, but I've got 3 others on my desk that I have to have reviewed before I can even think about taking on a 4th one at this point. I can relate to that. So that kind of dialogue, though, what it indicates is, or the opportunity it provides, is for me to interact with other researchers whose expertise bears on the subject matter in a way that is essentially not threatening to them, and so they feel at liberty to interact. And in some cases, an anonymous manuscript review has turned into a signed commentary. Oh, that's nice. In connection with an article, so it's been a good experience, and I think that will simply continue to increase as topics like Homo floresiensis, the Hobbit, or Homo naledi that has the dates keep getting younger, and the distinctiveness of this rather Australopithecine-like survivor alongside Homo has gains greater appreciation and awareness. I mean, it's just I think we'll see increased interest, like I said, in the upcoming generation.
Sure. No, I think that's exciting, and I hope that that's the case, because I think that, given the body of evidence, the ever-growing body of evidence, the reluctance to at least give it an objective examination by many is troubling. But like you say, maybe it's more subversive. Their interest is much more private because they're not ready to put their name on it and such. But I do want to talk to you a little bit about some of the varieties of reports that come in, as far as witness reports and the biodiversity that they describe, and there's so many similarities between reports here and in Australia, and in the Yeren and all of the many different varieties that happen to occur around the world. But do you think that there are possibly, well, I'm sure you've heard of the different types. There's this idea that there are type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, and I've heard it going all the way up to 12. I mean, it's just this amazing number of counting. But it's kind of, I guess the part that I get stuck at is, and the part that I'm trying to understand is, are there potentially different branches of this tree being represented around North America, and others around the world, or are these most likely a single ancestor that has branched out and maybe changed and adapted to its environment over time? But because we hear things like the three-toed tracks is a real sticker, and I don't know what to make of that. And granted, I'm just a layperson. I have no other interest than purely personal interest. But what are we dealing with here? What is your thoughts?
Right. Well, it's interesting when you go back to one of the earliest scientific contributions, that made by Ivan T. Sanderson in his Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life,
Sure.
which was published in the early 60s. But he, you've got this encyclopedic treatment of all these different creatures, and he was a naturalist in every sense of the word, and so he wove a context or described a context for these reports around the world, an ecological and biogeographic and so forth. And he arrived at, interestingly, 4 types.
Oh,
there was the Sasquatch-like, the giant ape-like one, and not limited to North America, but equivalency in much of Asia, Eastern Asia, Southern Asia, particularly, and up into the Caucasus. And then there was a type that was probably a relic ape, it was even more ape-like, the Abominable Snowman, the Yeti, that is. And then and was distinct and different. And to his credit, from my perspective especially, he relied heavily on the footprint evidence. It's interesting. Those academics who have been convinced of the validity of much of this evidence are individuals who can appreciate the footprint evidence.
Sure.
Sanderson wasn't specialized in that, but the point that he had a separate chapter just on footprints, and he figured them clearly and systematically. John Napier was the most sympathetic of those who viewed the Patterson-Gimlin film originally, sympathetic to the subject of Bigfoot. He wasn't so sympathetic towards the film, but yet he concluded in his book that he was convinced that Sasquatch existed in some form because something was leaving footprints. And he was a physician specializing in primate locomotion, particularly the hands and the feet. And then Dr. Grover Krantz was an anatomist / physical anthropologist, or the other way around, physical anthropologist / anatomist, who concentrated on the footprint evidence. That's what convinced him, and so on. And then, of course, myself. But so Sanderson had the Sasquatch type, the Yeti type. There was this more subhuman form, the Almas or Almasti, which has been repeatedly compared to a relic Neanderthal or perhaps Denisovan. Okay. And then you have the little ones, the Orang Pendek type of Southeast Asia, Sanderson included little creatures, hairy creatures in equatorial regions of Africa and South America as well, which biogeographically is a little more problematic to try to explain. The others, not so much. But yes, as I was alluding to earlier, this family tree is very bushy and with many branches that have persisted until quite recently. So in the known fossil record, and people have to bear in mind that the last date of occurrence in the fossil record does not mean necessarily the time of extinction. It's just when that last fossil happened to be not only fossilized, but even more importantly, discovered, uncovered. But, we've got evidence of Homo floresiensis. Initially, shook things up with a date of 13,000 years young. Now it's been pushed back a bit with more refined stratigraphy of the cave deposits, but we've got Homo heidelbergensis in East Asia as young as 20,000 years. We've got Neanderthals that are somewhere, but I heard one anecdotal report of it by a researcher, hasn't been published yet, as young as 10,000 years.
Oh, wow.
But at least 20 to 30,000 years. You've got, I mentioned Homo heidelbergensis, you've got Homo erectus in Java. The dates are still kind of contested, bounces back and forth between 25 and 75,000 years. But still, even at 75,000 years, that's remarkably young, and so on. And so, and that's just of those we know. New. Well, there's the Deer Cave people that probably represent, it's been suggested, Denisovans that are just a few tens of thousands of years old.
Wow.
And so on. And the list goes on. But the point is, no, I don't think they're all equivalent or even recent derivatives from a common ancestor. I think that, some of these branches, like Homo floresiensis, if that is the candidate source for something like an Orang-Pendek, we can trace its origins all the way back to probably Australopithecines or early Homo, like Homo habilis in East Africa, anywhere from 2 to 2.5 million years ago. Whereas something like the Almasti, if that's a remnant Neanderthal, then that diverged from a branch. That distinctive branch has its own unique origin, probably about 160,000 years ago, with a shared common ancestor like Homo heidelbergensis, and so on and so on. So we can, and what we don't know what Sasquatch is, whether it's Gigantopithecus extant or a Paranthropus. Is its bipedalism an expression of the adaptation that seems to characterize the hominin radiation as opposed to a convergent evolution of bipedalism amongst a large terrestrial great ape? So we don't know. But the point is they're distinctive. Now, as far as other and there are distinctions. I mean, when we talk about the footprints, and we're looking at the Sasquatch track being quite distinctive, retaining the primitive mid-tarsal break, the midfoot flexibility, flat archless foot, never expressing the arch, very broad dimensions, breadth to length ratios far exceed those of humans. Human creation. You have Neanderthals, which are more human-sized but robust, so very broad, splayed toes, and then the best evidence, the limited evidence, footprint evidence for the Yeti suggests a more ape-like condition with a divergent big toe.
Oh, okay.
And so, at least ape-like in the sense of analogy to extant apes, which, remember, are themselves relic hominoids.
Okay.
Populations that are very contracted, very limited, and potentially endangered, rare and endangered, on the verge of extinction themselves. And that the diversity of apes during the Miocene and Pliocene was much more extensive. I mean, hundreds of species of apes, as much like the hundreds of species of monkeys we have today. And then the little people, the orang pendek, etc. There's all kinds of names, regional names. But little feet with a non-divergent big toe, it seems.
Okay.
But yet a much more primitive, early hominin-looking foot, often with, in the case of the hobbit's skeleton that we have, a big toe that is noticeably shorter than the very long lateral digits, which is interesting combination of traits. Anyway, so now when it comes to things like three-toed, I've yet to see a three-toed print that was a real footprint.
Oh, okay.
There have been examples that have been, like from Southern California is a common one that always is. Those aren't footprints. They have no anatomy. They're just potholes somebody sprinkled plaster into to approximate
sure.
a weird, footprint kind of shape. But there's no anatomy there to be discerned. Three-toed, four-toed, could easily be an amputation.
Okay.
Natural or otherwise, natural or accidental, or frostbite, but again, and I'm not to rule out that there are potential genetic anomalies. Dr. John Green, not Dr. John Bindernagel, but John Green used to love to point out the tribe in Africa where this recessive genetic trait had become established in quite a number of the members of the village and extended family relations of the ostrich-footed people with this weird anomaly where the foot is literally kind of cleft between the third and fourth digits, and there's deformation and of the toes. The big toe is reduced in size, I think, as I remember. Very distinctive looking. Sure. So he'd point to that, and I'd say, yeah, but that's a very rare genetic anomaly. We don't see that running around. But it's, everything must be considered, and not necessarily probable, but considered.
Sure.
No. So that kind of variation, I don't think.
Okay.
Now it could be. I've made mention of and allowed for. The reality that anytime you have a widely dispersed population, especially one that's on, if you compare a black bear in Asia to an Asian black bear to a North American black bear versus Americanus, there are differences, and you can immediately see those apparent differences. So the Yeren seems to have a much more common occurrence of that reddish orangutan-colored hair.
Okay.
Then we get reports like that in North America, but in North America, the most common color is dark brown or black.
Right.
Likewise, when you have a wide distribution, continental distribution of any species, and especially with fragmentation of the habitats, it fold in these acknowledgement of ecological principles. Anytime you have a population that's widely dispersed, that doesn't have homogeneous gene flow throughout, then you can get regional variation, either genetic drift or adaptations, as you alluded to particular environmental conditions. So, there's Bergman's rule that when a population has a wide distribution across a latitudinal cline, that those in the northern latitudes tend to be bigger, larger body mass, and shorter, smaller appendages than those in the hotter, more southerly latitudes. So a black bear, down in the southeast looks different than a black bear in the northern Rockies of Canada.
Sure.
Just because of those kind of things. And likewise, perhaps, the Sasquatch exhibits some of those differences in body proportion or average body mass. But as far as there being, skunk apes are different because they're leaner and they're meaner and more aggressive and that kind of thing. I could be wrong, but I certainly don't see anything to substantiate those kind of anecdotal references.
I think that's important. And I really like that you spoke to the fossil record, because how many times do people say, well, there's no reference to that, no example of that in the fossil record, like it's this completed body of evidence. And it's always evolving, and they're always finding new things they didn't know were there. And I think people lose the fact that they think, well, the fossil record is this one absolute compendium of what can be here. And if we don't know about it, it didn't exist. Well,
right.
It's like, it's a record of what they've dug up yet.
No sooner have you said that than another discovery stuns and startles everyone.
Yes. Yeah.
How could we not have known that this?
It wasn't in the fossil record, but it is now.
Yeah. And it's the same, that same principle. There's so many times, not that many times, but it seems like it, that on frequent occasions, I've had someone say to me, and I guess it seems like a lot, because one of the people who said it was a past department chair, who said, I was born and raised in Idaho. I've hunted and fished all across the state. Sure. If it was out there, I would have seen it. and I've had many a hunter say something similar, but I've also had hunters who say to me that same expression, I've hunted all across the state. I've done this for decades, and I never have seen a thing. But you'll never guess what happened last month when I was out deer hunting.
Sure.
And then they describe their encounter or their footprint find. There's always that first time for some people.
Yes.
And it's as if the whole world has just done a 180 on them.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly they have a whole different attitude. Yeah. So when someone says to me, I've hunted and fished, I just say, well, be patient. You never know. It just might happen.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for that. But God, I was just going to ask you a question, and it just drifted right out of my head. But I think this stuff is all so incredibly fascinating, and as more voices like yours come forward, and hopefully there will be more, but your contributions are absolutely second to none. I mean, you've really forged a lot of credibility into this field that I think desperately needed it, because prior to this, nobody was listening. I mean, obviously John Green, John Bindernagel, other voices have been, in the choir as well. But yeah. I mean, we are a society that values authority, and that authority, it gives credibility. So, and you are certainly one of those people that has, given that leverage, because I think people, when they experience these things, they're kind of in their own microcosm of existence. They maybe don't want to talk about it because of what they've seen, and they don't want to be that guy or that woman or whatever. They don't want to be that person that is ostracized because something fantastic happened to them or something horrifying. But to have a voice like yours come forward and say, hey, you know what, there might be something here. Let's look into it. I just really appreciate that you are doing this, and that you've been brave enough to continue to do it, even in the face of all the adversity that you've encountered. Sure.
Well, thank you. It's much appreciated. Oftentimes those expressions aren't forthcoming as frequently as you'd like. But no, it's you make very good points. There still is a certain stigma, even today, associated with it. And it's interesting. Case in point, I was one time invited to speak at a Rotary Club here locally.
Oh.
And it was an over lunch, so there was not a lot of opportunity for people to linger and ask questions and so forth. But I'd allowed 10 minutes or so for a Q&A. Not a single question. Not a question. And so people started, we adjourned and people started leaving. And then about a half a dozen people had loitered and lingered until the room cleared out. Then they came up and approached me.
Oh.
And sort of sheepishly, with some reinforcement from one another, then they started asking some more questions and leading questions, and then shared their experiences.
Wow.
So it's, there's still peer pressure. There really is. Even despite the fact that and maybe it works against it, the fact that it has become such an icon of sort of Western Americana, Western and Eastern. Just Americana, period. That in some ways, while it popularizes and lifts some aspects of the stigma, it also, in some ways, some circles trivializes it. And as in so doing, people are not, that they don't think that they will be taken seriously. They'll just be lumped in with all of the crazy icons and logos and so forth.
Sure. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I can't tell you how much it means to me personally to have had this opportunity to talk with you and to share ideas and to hear your thoughts. A lot of the words you don't know or a lot of the words you said, I don't know, but I feel smarter just listening to you. It
motivates you to look up a few things.
I'll be spending the next couple hours Googling, but by God, you've done great. But thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And if, at some other time in the future, if you've got more time, because I can tell there's so much more that we could discuss, but thank you so much for this opportunity. And I will see you in Vernal, Utah, because you're going to be at Phenomicon, correct?
I am. Yeah, it's a fun trip to go out there, and the setting is beautiful, and it's always an interesting program. It expands my mind to some possibilities. Not excessively, I must say. I have my reaction to some of the presentations was a little guarded, but there were a lot of interesting phenomenon described that I there's always room for more consideration.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you again, sir, for making the time for me. I really appreciate it.
You're quite welcome.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us here on tonight's show. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please feel free to follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Paranormal Portal Radio, as well as finding us on Twitter. We're on Twitter at Paranormal Portal, Portl, and we'd love to have you stop by our YouTube page and subscribe and check out our shows there. We got hundreds of shows, Journeys into the Paranormal Portal, so I hope you'll check it out, guys. We're over there at youtube.com/Paranormal Portal, so hope to see you guys soon. We'll be back, of course, for more podcasts in the coming days. So we love you all. Be good, be kind, be nice, take care of each other, help each other out, find the magic in every day, and remember to laugh as much as you can.